It was late March 1964, and the party had been one of those Hollywood gatherings where famous people pretended to enjoy each other's company while secretly measuring their own fading relevance. Frank Sinatra had performed earlier, mostly to be polite to the host. He'd watched Marvin Gaye arrive late, quiet, moving through the room like someone who wasn't sure he belonged there. Marvin was 24, successful at Motown but unknown in these circles. The Rat Pack owned rooms like this. Marvin was just visiting. The house was one of those sprawling Bel Air estates with too many rooms and not enough warmth. The kind of place where conversations echoed and everyone spoke a little louder than necessary to fill the silence. Marvin had been invited by someone from the label, a connection he didn't fully understand, and he'd come because refusing felt worse than attending. He stood near the piano, far enough from the center to avoid attention, but close enough to seem engaged. He wasn't drinking much. He never did at these things. Alcohol made him too honest, and honesty at Hollywood parties was a liability. Frank had been drinking steadily since 8, bourbon mostly, and he was in that particular state of intoxication where everything seemed both hilarious and deeply meaningful. He'd noticed Marvin earlier, recognized him from somewhere, maybe a photo in a trade magazine, and when someone mentioned Motown, Frank remembered, the kid from Detroit, the one with the smooth voice who sang those romantic things teenage girls liked. Frank didn't listen to that music, didn't understand it, didn't see the point of it. Real singing was standards, was Gershwin and Porter and Berlin, was knowing how to hold a note without shouting, was control and phrasing and restraint. These Motown kids could shout, sure, but shouting wasn't singing. Someone had put on a record, something upbeat and forgettable, and people were dancing in that performative way people danced at parties when they wanted to be seen dancing rather than actually enjoying it. Frank walked over to the piano, sat down on the bench even though he had no intention of playing, and that's when he saw Marvin standing a few feet away, watching the room with an expression Frank couldn't quite read. Not boredom exactly, not discomfort either, something deeper, something that looked like loneliness dressed up as observation. "You're the Motown kid," Frank said, not as a question but as a statement of fact, and Marvin turned, startled, as if he hadn't expected anyone to speak to him directly. "Marvin Gaye, right?" Marvin nodded, extended his hand, and Frank shook it briefly, professionally, without warmth. "You sing those love songs, the things my daughter listens to." Marvin smiled politely, the kind of smile he'd learned to use in situations like this, a smile that meant nothing and protected everything. "Yes, sir, Mr. Sinatra." "That's right." Frank waved off the formality. "Don't call me that. Makes me sound old." He looked at Marvin more closely, squinting slightly as if trying to bring him into focus. "Can you read music? You Motown kids, do they teach you that? Or do you just feel your way through?" The question landed like a test, and Marvin understood it as one. This was how it worked in rooms like this. People didn't ask questions because they wanted answers. They asked questions to establish hierarchies, to remind you where you stood. Marvin had been standing in various versions of this room his entire life. His father's church, the Motown studio, backstage at the Apollo. Every place had its version of Frank Sinatra, someone who'd been there longer, done it better, earned the right to make you prove yourself. "I read music," Marvin said quietly, and it was true, though he rarely needed to. He learned by listening, by feeling, by absorbing the way sounds move through space. But he could read music if required, had studied it as a child, had been forced to learn by a father who believed discipline was the only path to anything worth having. Frank made a sound, something between a laugh and a dismissal. "These Motown kids," he said again, louder this time, addressing the room as much as Marvin. "They can shout, sure, but standards? Real singing?" He turned back to Marvin, and there was something in his eyes now, something sharp and challenging. "Can you even do a standard, kid? Something with actual structure? Not just 3 chords and a hook?" The room had quieted slightly. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough that a few people near the piano had turned to watch. Marvin felt their attention like heat, like something physical pressing against him. He wanted to leave. He wanted to walk out of this house, drive back to his apartment, sit in silence until the feeling passed. But leaving would mean something too. It would mean accepting what Frank was implying, that he didn't belong here, that Motown was lesser, that soul music was somehow not real music. Frank gestured to the piano. You know, Fly Me to the Moon? Everyone knows that one, even teenagers. He called over to the band that had been playing earlier, three musicians who'd been smoking in the corner, bored and waiting for the night to end. Hey, fellas, come play Fly Me to the Moon. Let's see if the kid knows the bridge. The musicians exchanged glances, shrugged, and moved toward their instruments. They didn't care about Frank's tests or Marvin's reputation. They were session players, hired help, and they'd play whatever they were told to play. The pianist sat down, ran his fingers over the keys to warm up, and looked at Marvin expectantly. Marvin stood very still. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, could feel the weight of the room's attention shifting fully toward him now. People were watching, curious, entertained by the prospect of seeing someone fail in a space designed for failure. He thought about his father, about all the times he'd been tested like this, forced to perform in church, forced to prove he was good enough, worthy enough, saved enough. He thought about Motown, about Berry Gordy's constant reminders that success was temporary, that you were only as good as your last hit. He thought about Tammy Terrell, about how she'd once told him that the only way to survive in this business was to stop caring what people like Frank Sinatra thought. But he did care. That was the problem. He cared too much. The band started playing. The arrangement was traditional, straight jazz, the kind of thing you'd hear in any lounge in Vegas or New York. Clean, professional, soulless. The pianist looked at Marvin, waiting for him to start singing, and Marvin stepped closer to the piano, close enough that he could rest his hand on it if he needed something to hold on to. In that moment before he opened his mouth, Marvin felt everything at once. He felt his father's belt across his back, heard the crack of leather, and the sermon about worthlessness that always followed. He felt the weight of every recording session where Berry Gordy had told him to do it again, cleaner, smoother, more commercial. He felt Tammy's hand in his during rehearsals, the only person who'd ever made him feel like he wasn't performing, even when he was. He felt the distance between Detroit and this room, and he understood suddenly that this wasn't about singing a song correctly. This was about translation. Frank was asking him to speak a language that wasn't his own, and the only way to survive was to refuse the premise entirely. The room was watching him with that particular kind of attention that felt like judgment dressed as curiosity. He could see a woman in a red dress whispering to her companion, could see a producer he recognized from television leaning against the wall with crossed arms, could see Frank himself settling back into the piano bench with the satisfied expression of someone who'd already written the ending to this story. They were all waiting for him to fail, or worse, to succeed in a way that confirmed their assumptions about what Motown music was. Simple, emotional, uneducated. If he sang it straight, he'd be dismissed as competent but unremarkable. If he struggled, he'd be proof that soul singers couldn't handle real music. Either way, he lost. Unless he changed what winning meant. He didn't sing the standard version. He couldn't. Not because he didn't know it, but because singing it the way Frank expected would have been a surrender, an admission that there was only one correct way to interpret a song, and Marvin had never believed that. Music wasn't a script to be followed. It was a conversation, and he was being asked to have this conversation in a language that wasn't his own. So he changed the language. He started with the melody, just as it was written, giving Frank and the room what they expected for the first 8 bars. His voice was smooth, controlled, technically perfect. He could hear Frank nodding along, satisfied, already preparing to dismiss him with faint praise. But then Marvin shifted. He took the bridge and bent it, adding a doo-wop harmony underneath, layering his voice the way he did in the studio, creating the illusion of multiple singers even though he was alone. He added gospel melisma, letting a single syllable stretch and curve and spiral into something that felt less like singing and more like prayer. And then, for the final 16 bars, he broke the song completely, turning it into a jazz scat, improvising around the melody with a freedom that made the original arrangement feel like a cage he'd just escaped from. When he finished, he didn't look at Frank. He looked at the floor, at his own hands. at anything except the faces watching him. The room was silent, and silence after a performance was always ambiguous. It could mean awe or disapproval, shock or boredom, and Marvin didn't trust himself to distinguish between them. Frank stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he started laughing. Not mocking laughter, not cruel laughter, but something that sounded almost like surprise. "Who the hell taught you that?" Frank asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now, the challenge replaced by something that might have been respect. Marvin looked up. "The church," he said quietly. "You wouldn't understand." Frank stopped laughing. He stood up from the piano bench, walked over to the bar, poured himself another drink, and raised his glass toward Marvin. "You just rewrote the Rat Pack rulebook, kid." He took a long sip, shook his head, and then added, almost to himself, "Maybe we've been doing this wrong the whole time." The party continued, but something had shifted. People approached Marvin differently now, spoke to him with a deference they hadn't shown before. He answered their questions politely, smiled when appropriate, but inside he felt the same emptiness he always felt after performing. It didn't matter if he'd impressed Frank Sinatra or rewritten anything. Tomorrow Frank would go back to Vegas, and Marvin would go back to Detroit, and the gap between their worlds would close again, as if this night had never happened. He left the party just after midnight, slipping out through a side door while conversations continued in the main room. No one noticed him leaving. That was how he preferred it, becoming invisible the moment the performance ended. He drove down the winding Bel Air roads in his rented car, the city lights spreading below him, like a map of places he didn't belong. He hadn't won anything tonight. He'd survived. There was a difference. Winning implied a contest where both parties agreed on the rules. But Frank Sinatra didn't need Marvin's approval. Frank had already won everything there was to win. That performance wasn't a competition, it was a test, and Marvin had passed only because he'd refused to take it on Frank's terms. Marvin pulled over at a lookout point, turned off the engine, and sat in silence. The city hummed below him, indifferent and enormous. He'd proven tonight that he could compete in Frank Sinatra's world, but he didn't want to compete there. He wanted to build something else entirely, something that didn't require him to translate himself, but he didn't know if that was possible. The music industry wasn't interested in what artists wanted. It was interested in what sold. He started the car again and drove back to his hotel. And by the time he arrived, he'd already begun the process of forgetting tonight had meant anything at all. That was survival too. Remembering victories hurt worse than forgetting them, because victories were temporary and the emptiness was permanent. But the next morning, Frank called his band leader. "I want strings," he said, "like Motown uses. Lush, layered, emotional. These kids know something we forgot." The band leader asked what had changed, and Frank didn't explain. He just repeated the instruction and hung up. Years later, in an interview conducted in 1979, Frank was asked about the evolution of his sound in the mid-60s, the way his arrangements had become warmer, more textured, less rigid. "Marvin Gaye taught me something," Frank said, and the interviewer looked surprised because Frank Sinatra wasn't known for crediting other artists with influencing his work. "He taught me that soul isn't a genre. It's a requirement. You can have all the technical skill in the world, but if you're not putting your soul into it, you're just making noise." Marvin never saw that interview. He was in Belgium by then, isolated, battling his demons, convinced that nothing he'd done mattered anymore. He didn't know that Frank Sinatra remembered that night, didn't know that his performance had lodged itself in Frank's mind the way certain moments do, refusing to be forgotten. He didn't know that session musicians in Los Angeles had started asking for Motown charts, that producers were telling their artists to listen to Marvin Gaye records to understand what emotional authenticity sounded like. He didn't know because no one told him, and even if they had, he wouldn't have believed it. Marvin spent his life convinced that he was never enough, that every success was temporary, that every moment of recognition was just a prelude to the inevitable failure that would prove he'd been a fraud all along. That night at the Bel Air party should have been a triumph. Frank Sinatra, the king of traditional American music, had acknowledged that Marvin knew something he didn't. But Marvin walked away from that night feeling exactly the way he'd felt walking in, alone, out of place, performing for people who would never truly see him. The pianist from that night, a session player named Eddie, remembered it differently. In an oral history recorded in 1991, he described watching Marvin transform the song in real time. "I'd played that standard 1,000 times," Eddie said. "Same arrangement, same tempo, same everything. It was like a math equation. You play the notes, the singer sings the words, everyone applauds, you get paid." But that night, Marvin took that equation and turned it into something I'd never heard before. He didn't disrespect the song. He honored it by making it his own. And Frank knew it. You could see it in his face. He knew he'd just witnessed something he couldn't do, no matter how many years he'd been singing. Eddie paused in the interview, looked off camera, and then added, "The sad part is, I don't think Marvin knew how good he was. He performed like he was apologizing for taking up space, like he was asking permission to exist. And that's the tragedy, right? He changed the way people thought about singing that night, and he walked out of that room thinking he'd barely passed the test." That was March 1964. By March 1965, Marvin would have his first major solo hit. By 1971, he would release an album that redefined what popular music could be. By 1984, he would be dead, killed by his father in the house where he'd grown up, the same house where he'd learned to sing in church, where he'd been taught that nothing he did would ever be good enough. But on that night in Bel Air, standing at a piano in a room full of people who didn't understand him, Marvin Gaye took a song that belonged to Frank Sinatra's world and made it his own. He didn't do it to prove anything. He did it because he didn't know how to sing any other way. And in that moment, whether he realized it or not, he won.